Good afternoon, folks. We are going to get started in just a moment. And let me make sure everyone knows we are recording today's session. And so everyone who joins and who's signed up will get a link to the recording after the fact. I see our numbers are jumping. So that is great. So I'm going to drop a note in the chat here as a reminder of some of our protocols. And double checking, yes, we are recording. Okay. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the latest edition of HDO's webinar series. My name is Lewis Miller, and I'm the Assistant Director of the HDO program here at UT Austin. Today we are joined by Dr. Keri Stevens and Rodney Schlosser. Keri and Rodney are here to provide you with tools and techniques for improving external business relationships in our rapidly changing workplace environments. For this webinar, they are drawing on material from their new HDO professional course, The Art of Business Relationships, which will have its inaugural run on November 1st of this year. Keri is a professor in organizational communication technology and co-director of the Technology and Information Policy Institute at the Moody College of Communications here at UT Austin. She has been on faculty at UT for 16 years, and prior to her time at UT, she spent a decade in the industry. Rodney is the Senior Vice President of Business Development and Strategic Partnerships at Asurion, a multi-billion-dollar company focused on the mobile, cable, telco, and consumer electronics industries. Rodney developed an earlier version of this course for Asurion. A few notes before we get started. Please keep your microphones muted during the presentations. If you have any pressing issues or questions during the session, feel free to send me a direct message. At the conclusion of the presentation, there will be approximately 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. And I'll now turn things over to Keri and Rodney. I hope you guys enjoy the session.
Hi, everybody. Excited to be here with you. I'm Keri Stevens. I'm going to share our slides and we're going to get started for the day. You know, when we started this webinar and Rodney and I first started working together on this, you know, I immediately realized how valuable it was to have somebody who has all the years of experience that he has working in industry with a lot of different kinds of clients, including calling on Fortune 500 companies. And he's also worked with mid-sized companies and nonprofits as well.
And Keri has been a very, very valuable partner as we've been working on this for the last few months, because she brings both an academic perspective with more than 15 years at UT, with a special emphasis on digital communications, and spent more than a decade before that in industry. So we've really tried to bring together both what's happening in the marketplace with what the research says.
Absolutely. And so if we take a look at kind of what our goals are for today, Rodney, I'm kind of curious. Share with us what you feel like is the top takeaway from our session today.
Yeah, well, we've tried to make the most of what is really about 30 or 45 minutes. The course that we put together in November is going to look at the art of building business relationships from a holistic perspective, with some hands-on, with some exercises. Today, we thought that we might focus on a subset of that. And for today's discussion, we're really going to focus on questions, which might seem like either an obvious or something that doesn't matter much, but in fact, it is strategic to building relationships. Because as we all know, the process of building relationships involves sharing. And through that sharing process, we begin to develop rapport, but we also gather information. Two of the most important tools for that process is what we hear and what we see, because we learn with what we hear and what we see. So your ears and your eyes become very key. And so today's focus will be on questions as a component, as a tool towards building relationships.
And I'm a big believer that even though I know a lot of you are eating lunch, and that's totally fine, I also would love a little bit of feedback as we go through. So let me just kind of quickly remind those of you who may not be as familiar with Zoom, if you look at the very bottom of your toolbar, you'll have some options for reactions. So the one I want you to use today is just the yes and the no, nice and simple. So let me ask a quick question and see how many people are able to click the yes or no button. Are you familiar with these functions inside Zoom? And I have my group open here so I can see as you click on either yes or no and find those reactions. All right, I have a few people who raised hands. That also works. Any kind of reaction is good to go. Great. I have a few there. Wonderful. Wonderful. Quite a few people. Okay, great. Because I wish the way that they do these seminars, I can't just have you speak out. But of course, we're a bigger group, so that makes it a little harder to do. So I also want you to feel free to use the chat as we go through. And periodically, we'll try to monitor that. And then at the end, we'll definitely answer a bunch of questions. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Rodney, take us away.
Well, so we've set the foundation that questions are a component towards building relationships. And I'm a big checklist guy. Some of these checklists become so natural to me that I don't even have to write them down. I can process them in my mind. So when I'm thinking about building relationship, and it starts with a meeting in person or virtually, I begin with a key checklist, and I think of it as the big three, which is what's the purpose of that conversation? And I force myself to really think through what is the objective? What does success look like in that conversation? Number two is what's the venue? Because the venue can have a dramatic impact on both what I might ask, how I might ask, when I might ask it. And the venue can be accretive or dilutive. Is it going to be in someone's office? Is it going to be in a conference room? I've had meetings in the lobbies of headquarters locations because that's when I could have that important conversation. Or is it at a restaurant or a bar? I've had meetings in the corporate cafeteria at big companies. And while that might seem very relaxed, the reality is it changes how I prepare and how I approach those conversations, because both the person I'm meeting with might be distracted by people they know, and I might know people at that company who walk by as well. So giving consideration to the venue is essential. And finally, durability. That's just really another word for what's the strength of the relationship. Is it someone you're meeting for the first time, or is it someone you know well and you're doing a touch base? Often it's somewhere in between. It's someone who you have met before, but it may not be an incredibly strong relationship. So assessing durability is key as a part of that planning, building the questions, and a part of that preparation.
And one of the first things that you really want to do is do your homework, Google the company. And I know this sounds like we all are like, we've been told to do this before, but I want you all to think, how many times do you actually plan the time before a meeting to sit down and do these things? I think it's really important to actually schedule it on your schedule, because otherwise, if you're like most people, you're running from place to place, and these little details get missed, but they really matter. The other thing you want to think about is plan how you're going to listen in conversations. I'll share two different ways that I do this. And the first thing is you will find me taking notes, even if I'm one-on-one with someone. And if I'm really honest, the reason I'm doing that is to help me stay focused. It makes me a better listener when I take notes. There's research actually that suggests that physically taking notes helps you actually remember the content better as well. The other trick I'll give you is if you have a tendency to want to interrupt people, some type of a physical cue is the trick to help you keep your mouth shut. And you notice I'm doing this with my finger. What I do is I press my fingers together. And the nice thing is I can hide it under the table or whatever, but it literally is my physical cue that reminds me, Keri, keep your mouth shut and listen. That's what you're supposed to be doing here. And a lot of us have a lot of challenges, I think, with listening. So those are my two tips. Now, Rodney, you have an exception to share, right?
When Keri and I met late this spring, I gave her an example of a very important exception to taking written notes, because I agree, taking written notes is both a discipline, but it also records information for you. And that is important meetings where the person you're meeting with or the people you're meeting with will be less candid because they see you taking notes. For some people, it's very uncomfortable to have what they're being said put on a pad of paper or typed into a computer. They'll be cautious. And in those circumstances, you have to do what works for that situation, which is keep the pen down, keep the pen away, put the pad away, the computer away, and instead know, if you make that decision, how you're going to capture that information. There's two obvious ways I do it. One is as soon as the meeting concludes, I jot down all the notes. The alternative, which is increasingly popular, is that you dictate it into text or to a voicemail so that you can download quickly while it's fresh without in any way deterring the kind of rapport that you want to have in the conversation. Hey, Keri, if I can touch on one other item here, which is in the course of preparing the questions, and you and I know talked about this, often you will want to write down those questions. But as we both know, you don't want to necessarily walk in with those questions on your pad of paper or on your smartphone, because that will really change the tone, right? You might take some notes, you might have some key words. Exactly.
Sorry, I had to do that because a lot of people, especially younger people, will walk into others' offices with their phone in hand and they're legitimately taking notes. I will tell you that if you're going to do that, and I have very mixed feelings, the research is very mixed on this as well. If you're going to do it, tell people, oh, I'm going to get my phone out and take notes. I know that sounds trivial, but everyone who's over about 40 will immediately think you're playing on your phone and not paying attention in the conversation. So I think as technology has expanded, that's definitely something we want to keep in mind. A lot of people view it as impolite, as the comment is in here. Absolutely.
So let's switch the conversation to preparing for the conversation. And remember, we've focused today on how questions are an ingredient towards building relationships. And as a part of those questions, we need to be prepared. And again, this sounds so trite. It sounds so obvious, but I have seen so many colleagues, both who I work with day to day and people who work for other companies that I have allied with over the course of years, miss this. In fact, in some ways, it's because it's so obvious that we fail to do it regularly and thoroughly. Again, I mentioned I'm a checklist person, and so I want to touch on the key items in the checklist. The first Keri has touched on, which is the search. Now, of course, everyone will do a search, but doing the search in a way that is strategic is much more valuable than just doing the search. It's on both the company and the industry and the individual. Sometimes you'll find out that this happened to me very recently. I did a search 2 days before the meeting to get prepared. And then I did something that I find very useful. I do a search right before the meeting starts, because particularly if you're calling on a public company or if you're in fundraising in some type of development work, the person you're seeing in either case, the company or the individual, might have had a major change occur that day. And if you don't know that, two things will happen. One is you will appear to be less informed, and two is you won't recognize that the circumstances in that discussion have changed without your control. Very important that you do that kind of research. Let me just touch on two other quick items. One is reviewing notes. It's easy to say, oh, I have it all in my mind. But in fact, go and look at the notes, whether you have notes in your files or you have a CRM system. Perhaps other colleagues have talked to that same person before. Perhaps other vendors who you work with or other people, if you're in the fundraising world, have made an appeal to that person. Capture that information so you have that context. Number two is inventory. Whether, again, you're working in a business development or sales role for a for-profit company or you're in a nonprofit role, it's important to understand what's on the mind of the person you're talking to. Who else do they work with? Who are their other vendors? If it's a nonprofit fundraising situation, who has this person or this foundation given to recently? And has there been some change in the governance or the organization? And then finally, this is so easy to overlook. What is the expectation of the person you're meeting or talking with? It may be the defined objective that was in the meeting planner, but it may be something else. And sometimes what's in the meeting planner or what's stated in the email when you set up the meeting is one of your objectives, but you have some secondary important objectives that you need to consider as well. In fact, sometimes you'll find that you'll set a meeting with a stated topic, but the most valuable part of that discussion is going to be the question that wasn't stated, but for which the person has their guard down and they will be more willing to share.
Absolutely. So since yes, no doesn't work on your version of this kind of a webinar, let's have you raise your hand. But I want you to be honest. How many of you really do prepare before every single meeting? Like every time, you always do it very carefully? We probably have a handful of people who really do. I think that a lot of people kind of think they do, or maybe it varies. Sometimes they'll make the time to plan. And, you know, when Rodney and I were working through the course, we both realized that this is something we've seen in people we've supervised as the really successful people. If you travel with them, they'll say, okay, now let's prep before the meeting. And so I think making this just kind of a normal part of our routine is really important. Another thing that's really important is to think about how you structure the questions. And so I have taught this kind of concept for a very long time. And I will tell you that adult learners, college students, all ages, we all struggle with asking open-ended questions, something we have to practice. And if we get into those yes, no questions, do you have this? And it's not this open, how does this happen? Why is this happening? People will be a lot shorter on how they respond to you. So remember to keep those questions open.
You know, Keri, as you touched on, open-ended questions are the key to what really becomes a big garden, because when given the opportunity to answer a question, I'm going to be much more expressive, much more complete if it's open-ended. If I'm given a yes, no, particularly if I'm short on time, I'm going to take advantage of the yes, no, and the person who's hearing what I'm sharing is going to get relatively limited information. It will be binary. It just won't be very rich, which gets to the topic of rapport. Clearly, how we prepare, plan, and deliver questions is built on a foundation of rapport. It's more difficult at the beginning because you don't know the person as well. It gets richer, it gets stronger, it gets more comfortable as we have more rapport. And establishing rapport is something that is very individualized. It's like a snowflake. But there are some things that are common, and these apply whether you're in person or you're in a virtual situation like we are today. The first, and I mentioned before, using your ears and your eyes, is in fact using those two tools. When you're with someone in person or looking at them via a video process, what do you see? And again, it seems so obvious. Are there pictures of a kid or kids, a spouse, an animal? Are there indications of their loyalty to a sports team? Are there signs or plaques indicating that they've been recognized by their employer? Sometimes travel is a natural way to have a discussion, particularly as you enter the summer. Do you have any travel plans for the summer? Any vacation plans for the summer? There are other cues that are equally important, but you really have to deal with from the downside. Are they looking at their watch regularly? Are they looking at their smartphone regularly? Are they looking at their computer regularly? Are they looking down regularly? And those things have to be ingested in the course of not only the mood, but also how you might have to make on-the-fly changes to the questions that you've prepared, not written down, and you are sharing based on the context.
And you know, more and more, we're doing our meetings online. And they're really challenging. I published my first paper on webinars in 2006. So I've actually been doing research right in this space. And when the pandemic hit, I was like, okay, it looks like everybody's going to be doing this now. And all the challenge about figuring out who that other person is on the other end of a video call is super hard. So I want to invite you to think for a minute, what cues have you used to help you build rapport online? And if you want to, go ahead and type that into the chat. I'll have a couple of people. And while other people are typing some cues that they use to give them ideas about questions to ask, I'm going to give you 2 tips. One of them we did not do today. And it's very hard to do on automated web seminars where you have big groups. But that's not the bulk of your meetings, right? So when you have the opportunity to either attend a meeting or you're leading a meeting, show up early when you can. It is amazing. This happened to us today. We got on And immediately we were all chit-chatting about vacations and where we had gone. It is a natural way to build a rapport while you're waiting on everybody to join the meeting. And the norm in a lot of organizations, unfortunately, is to wait a couple of minutes till you start. All that more time to chit-chat and build rapport before the official meeting begins. This is not practiced very much. And the research that was done back in the early 2000s says that you need to be doing this. But a lot of people put that, oh, the meeting will begin at exactly 10 a.m. Don't do that. If you can avoid it, take advantage of that extra time. My second tip I'm going to give you here is whenever people are introducing themselves, invite them to not only introduce themselves professionally, but tell one personal thing about themselves. Some people will take you up on it. Some people won't. A lot of times that's also very telling in building rapport. There's a couple of other things to think about with rapport. And one is that our goal here is to find something that you have in common with that other person. And this is definitely a lot more for a first-time meeting. But I really want to stress that rapport building does not have to come at the beginning of a meeting. There are times, if you can structure a meeting to deliberately end early, a lot of times that's where rapport building can really be beneficial, is at the end of a meeting. And so think beyond this whole, oh, I've got to do this really uncomfortable chit chat at the beginning, and online it's even worse. Think about maybe at the end of the meeting, that might be an ideal time to do it.
So Keri, hearing you talk about rapport and from our conversation in advance caused me to remember an article that I'd come across several years ago, 2015, Fast Company, which is a really good magazine and covers this topic on a somewhat regular basis, published an article called The 8 Habits of Curious People. Now, I think of myself as being eternally curious. My wife says it's sometimes annoying. And the reason why is because I'm interested in learning a lot more about a lot of things. And it's not insincere. I am genuinely eternally curious. There is a way for all of us to become curious. And if one of your goals for the rest of this year is to strengthen business relationships, find a way to become more curious, because that curious will show up as being authentic. And that curiosity will lead to better questions, which will lead to more information, which is a building block for rapport. And in the article, which we will send you a copy of at the end of the webinar, there are several good tips, 8 of them to be precise. But one of the ones that I particularly like is one that has been used in the journalism industry for many years. Who, what, when, where, how. Think about that. Who, what, when, where, how. And if you apply that question or that filter to a business decision that's being made, an evaluation of vendors, someone at a foundation who is contemplating making a grant to your organization, if you can apply that, you'll find that you're able to, at a minimum, ask right and appropriate questions and often get good information. The other item that I like in the article is the comment, which is curiosity must be instilled intentionally. We don't naturally necessarily provide information. There needs to be some type of a question at the right time, presented with the right tone, at the right place. But curiosity becomes a very important component of questions, which leads to relationships.
So I'm going to give you all a second and let's see if a couple of people will put, what's some of your favorite rapport building type questions? And a couple of people already said some things here, which I thought were great. So do you have a favorite type of rapport building question? One of the things I want to let everybody know is that the way that Rodney and I run seminars whenever we're in person is to really focus on the fact that you can learn a lot from each other as well. And so the interaction that we do in person is really things that you can share with one another a lot of times and learn from the expertise of others. Weather, oh my gosh, isn't weather, everybody right now can whine about the weather together. And you know, I like that. That is definitely something that we see. And whenever it's hot like this and you can talk about things like that, Nobody's going to disagree with that, right? It's hot. Some of us like the heat a little better than others, but definitely great. So we have weather, food, dining, absolutely. Get personal journey kind of questions. Oh, you have unique backgrounds on Zoom meetings. Absolutely, it gives people something to talk about. Music, yes, yes, yes. People sometimes start with music. Great. All right, y'all have lots of fantastic ideas. And I think sometimes we get stuck in ruts and we're asking people the same old questions over and over again. So getting some new ideas here from your peers, I think is a really great strategy. In terms of preparing questions, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this book. It's been around for a long time. It's called Crucial Conversations. You can even get an old version copy of it, a couple of editions back for probably just $2 or $3. Even the new ones, I don't think more than about $20. But it's really a nice book. It forces you to think about those really important conversations that sometimes catch you off guard, and let you think about how do you prepare in advance to take advantage of those really important times. You know, you really do need to have this repertoire of questions to pull from, because in the moment, it's really great to be able to make a split decision. Is this the right question? Am I asking it at the right time and the right way? And I wish we could hand you a formula and say, these questions always work. They don't. This is something you have to try out for yourself. But if you have a lot of different options to pull from, it decreases the anxiety that you feel whenever you feel under pressure. And it increases the likelihood that you're going to approach somebody with a great question instead of one that you kind of hum and haw and go into.
Keri, one of the things that I have found in the course of questions is that I go into a meeting, again, whether it's in person or virtually, with, as we described before from the checklist, very clear ideas in my mind about how I want to approach the conversation and what I want to cover. But I have to be very, very agile, because using, again, eyes and ears, I might hear or see things which will require that I make a game time change. And this does require practice. It requires practice from doing it a lot, but it also requires the practice that we described at the beginning, and we'll discuss in a moment, which is being prepared for the unexpected. And the way you do that really does play out with whether the meeting ends with all you wanted and more, or a disappointment, both for you and the person you're meeting with. The phrase that I tend to lean on is that relationships are in a constant state of deterioration. And so it's our job to constantly be fertilizing them. In fact, I think of those of us who have relationships as a core part of our success professionally as being regularly tasked with identifying, establishing, and fertilizing relationships. And it isn't just in the preparation, and it isn't just in the post meeting, it's also in how you ask and listen and share a model. Keri, one other thing I want to touch on, which is coming off as interrogating someone. If you go in with the best of preparation, with the best of understanding of the context, of the durability, and you interview the person, unless you've told them in advance you're interviewing them, there's going to be some stress. People don't want to be interviewed. People don't want to feel like they'll be interrogated. They don't want to feel like the district attorney has showed up. And I think for those of us who are eternally curious, you really have to be a self-governor to make sure that your pace, your intensity, and the volume of your questions is pulled back so that it feels like a conversation.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the comments you made earlier about, I think both of us commented on how important it is to do your homework and check things that are going on with the company right before you go in and meet with them. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is they ask them questions and people are kind of sitting, well, why didn't they look that up before they got here? All that's on my LinkedIn profile, or all that's on my website. And so one good way to avoid that interrogation is don't ask questions where you can look up the answers. And so I think that's really good. Let's go ahead and take a moment and have everybody raise their hand. How many of you have experienced people that kind of come in there and they bombard you with question after question after question? Yeah. Yeah. Lots of us have experienced that. And you know what goes through our mind is we're sitting there thinking, what's the point of this? Is this of value? If you do have questions to ask people, be honest and straightforward and say, may I ask you a few questions to better understand your business or better understand this particular issue? Let them know what's going on instead of just hitting them with a bunch of questions. All right. So now that we've kind of talked about planning and preparing questions, let's talk about some tips on practicing. And one of the things that I am a huge contingency planner. I tell everybody that if you ever pull up in the car next to me, you might see me talking to myself in the car because I'm practicing out loud what I'm about to say in a meeting, in a class I'm teaching. There is a very big difference, and the research supports this, between you reading what you're thinking of doing, your questions, and you speaking it out loud. When you hear it, it's a very different kind of an interpretation than you just reading. And so maybe you need to find a private place to speak out loud and not feel foolish, because I don't think everybody wants to be talking to themselves driving down the road. But, you know, in a private room, speak out loud. You also can find a willing colleague or a friend to be able to bounce ideas off of. And then the other thing you want to do is when you're finished with a business conversation, in addition to pulling together your notes, putting them in a CRM, a customer relationship management type system, whatever you need to do to manage your notes, think about what did you learn? And also think about what did they learn about you? I think that's really important. Maggie,
Hey, Keri, one other item on the practice topic, which I think is one that we often don't think about until it's too late, is practicing how you will react when you hear the answers to your questions. I've been in situations where I heard something I didn't expect, and it could have set me in a way that would have derailed the rest of my questions or the mood. And so over time, what I've realized is I need to be prepared not only for the questions and the context and the interruptions, but I need to be prepared for answers that may be different than what I expected, favorably or unfavorably. And that, to your point about practice, results in you in some ways having to practice how you'll react to the unexpected.
you know, so that's a really great point. And I love what Tina and Maggie both said in the chat. If you're going to be meeting with somebody over Zoom, practice over Zoom. What's really nice about Zoom is there are things you can do outside the scope of the camera. And if you're sitting here and you really want to go, right, you can hold your expression back, but with your hands, you're sitting here going, oh my gosh, what do I do with this? So sometimes that need to get some physical energy out, you're actually advantaged on Zoom, because in person, they're going to see your whole body reacting. And so I love the idea of practicing on Zoom. The other tip that Maggie said, which I also agree with, is record yourself and play it back. One of my absolute favorite things are the voice memos option on my iPhone. I do that constantly. There are even times whenever I really like my voice memo, and then I take it to an AI system or pay somebody to actually transcribe my notes. Because the other thing you'll find out when you practice, some people are a lot better verbally saying something than they are writing it down. Other people, they write it down beautifully, and then when they say it out loud, you're like, what are they even talking about? And so there's a difference between how you practice and how you hear what you're doing in this. And so look for those opportunities to practice. I think that a lot of times we're too embarrassed to admit that we want to practice, but if it's important, I was literally just on a meeting 30 minutes before this started, where we had a conversation and said, can we all get together and practice how we're going to strategically make an ask at a very high level at our university? And we actually wanted 4 people involved in practicing that ask. And so it's a really common thing to do once you get it normalized in your organization. All right, well, listen, we are coming to the end, but we have a few more things to do. So Rodney, you want to kind of wrap us up?
Yeah, so just to start where we were about 30 minutes ago, the focus of the course we're doing in the fall is business relationships. And a subset of business relationships is questions. Questions becomes the currency to both capture information and also to build rapport. But just going at questions without preparation and planning can lead to disaster. So the key with questions is to not only prepare, but to really think about the experience holistically. We've talked about the research. We've talked about how you find the time, the tone, the place. You deal with the environmental distractions or enhancements. And as we've just talked about, you also prepare for what you might hear and how you're going to capture the information so that you leave feeling more bullish that not only have your objectives been met, but that you have the information to build on that relationship and achieve your business or your organization's goals. All of this can be accomplished, but the secret and so obvious ingredient is preparation. We talked about at the beginning of the session, and it's very easy when we get busy and we get distracted to not prepare for meetings. And that's really doing two things. One is setting yourself up for potential problems, but more importantly, missing opportunities. Because as the book Crucial Conversation points out, the preparation can lead to not only a very, very vibrant conversation with information that you can act on, but it will fortify, or the word I like to use, fertilize the relationship. And again, questions are one component, one ingredient towards building relationships. And that's what we'll cover in the fall session. But today was designed to focus on this key element.
Great. And the last thing that I want to do here is, would you all do me a favor and type in the chat, just what is one new idea that you got? It can be just a reminder to do some of this. It can be, I never thought about coming to a meeting early. Whatever it is, give us a few types in the chat of some key things that you learned today. Pushing your finger really hard. Yeah. That one's been a trick of mine my whole life. The music, yeah, that was a great suggestion somebody had. Wonderful. Wow, this is great. Good. Reactions, good. I'm glad that you brought that up, Rodney. Yeah. Great. Great. These are fantastic, y'all. This is exactly what we hoped that y'all would get out of this. So thank you for sharing this. That's really great. You like the fertilizer metaphor. I have to chuckle every time Rodney's used that. I'm from rural Texas, and I feel like fertilizer has a little different meaning when you grow up in the country.
A big city person thinks of fertilizer very differently than someone from rural Texas.
Exactly. All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap up. Rodney, you want to take it away?
Yes, so the course that we've been working on that will be presented in the fall, as Lewis touched on, is called The Art of Business Relationships. I think Lewis is going to touch on how to find that because it's on the UT Austin Extended Education Ventures website, and as well on HDO, the Human Dimensions Organization, where there's a full menu of courses that are complementary to the program we're putting together. We're also available to talk with you through Lewis's organization about something that is more customized for your company or your organization, which can be done at your headquarters location if you're doing an offsite, and also it can be done on a half-day basis or a full-day basis, with probably as few as 6, 8, or 10 people being a part of it. And of course, then it can be customized to specific opportunities and challenges that both the individuals in that session have, but more importantly, that are facing your company, your organization, your institution. And I see you've passed on in the chat now the link to the Fast Company article so that folks can pull that article again, 8 Habits of Curious People.
Yeah, and one of the things that Rodney's done whenever he's taught in his company these topics is he's used a lot of publicly available, short, brief, practical business articles. And that's something we're incorporating into the course so that you can walk away with things that you can turn around and share among your colleagues and peers. Because I think that's the reason why you do any type of professional development work, is then to be able to pass those ideas on to others.
Keri, one item on the issue of sharing. So I think that sometimes in our work, we feel as though not only do we want to succeed, but it's a competition. And I recognize that we are in some ways in a competitive environment. But as it relates to this topic, I have found that my colleagues, people who work at other companies, and even my competitors are some of my best teachers. This is one of those situations where you can learn from others, incorporate it into your own style, incorporate it into your own approach, and come out better for it. I recognize that folks may do the same with me, and I think that's okay, because at the end of the day, strong relationships are in fact not only the litmus test for success in business, but they're the litmus test for the success in life.
Louis, do you want to take some questions now?
Yeah, and I've collected some of the questions that have already come in through the chat. If any of the attendees, if y'all would like to throw questions in the chat, we will get to them. I'm going to take a co-host prerogative and ask one of my own real quick first. You guys both touched on expectations and reactions, both in what people expect from a meeting, and then Rodney, you talked about like controlling your physical, verbal reactions to things. I know that I've been guilty in the past of scheduling meetings with an internal audience or an external audience, and the main item in the meeting was something that I've spent maybe weeks, months being super excited about. Show up, deliver this new news, idea, whatever it is, and immediately expect the other people to have my level of enthusiasm, and not giving them time to process that I'm, presenting something completely new to them. And so keeping in mind, like, right, you've sat with this for months, for weeks, for a year, however long it might be, and remembering that these people are just getting this in this live meeting session, whether it's online or in person. So that might not be a question, but it's a situation that involves both expectations and reactions that I definitely know I've been guilty of in the past.
Well, I don't know if it's about guilt, but I think that you've touched on something that is mission critical. We often have these important conversations with colleagues. We are either jointly going to see someone or a Zoom, or we're having a colleague or two join us as subject matter experts. Very common, right? And one of the things that my colleagues know, because I force them to do a prep session with me before any one of these meetings, is I say to them exactly what you touched on, which is, please remember that the audience has not focused on this anywhere near both the time or depth that you have, which means that you need to take it slower, speak more carefully, avoid acronyms, and don't be deflated by their reaction not being as excited as we had in the conference room for the last 2 weeks while we were discussing and preparing. Because you want to make sure, particularly when you bring colleagues, and especially if you're the ringleader in that meeting, that you don't suffer from their disappointment, from their unusual reaction, right? So that they have the same history and perspective that you have. And so to your point, you go into a big meeting at UT Austin, you've been working on something for 2 weeks, you present the idea with the drum roll, and the audience doesn't react. That doesn't mean that they don't like the idea. That doesn't mean that they think you're not a very strong member of the team. They just need a chance to soak it in. And if you had folks with you who didn't have that context, they might equally show in their body language disappointment, which actually might trigger the wrong reaction in the audience you were trying to inspire, support, and enthusiasm. So all of this takes tremendous preparation. And so to your point on the questions, be aware of where the other people you're talking with are and how your colleagues need to be on one team.
Absolutely. And I'll give one tip, and that is, I think that a lot of times whenever we're really excited about something, we want to show everybody all the research we did, all the background material, and we actually don't get to the punchline fast enough. People are impatient today. I think that a lot of times if we flip it and we kind of say, this is the idea, this is how it came, and then we give the background information, especially in an online meeting, if people don't feel like they should be participating quickly, they're going to leave. They're just going to turn their camera off and disappear. And then when you get to that exciting point, they're not even going to hear it because they checked out.
Well, thank you guys for taking my question. Some other ones that have come in. Is there a certain situation or demographic that you find generally aren't very candid or open up, or is this something that you kind of have to evaluate in each circumstance?
Well, I think that, we talked a little about profiling who you're meeting with. If you're going to see someone about an RFP or request for proposal, it's clearly going to be a buyer-seller situation. And that applies both in the for-profit world, the nonprofit world, the government world. Then in some cases, it's best to expect, unless you know the person, that there's going to be a more formal set of rules that apply, stated or unstated. So one of the keys that can apply here is to try to build relationships when you don't need them. And that may seem counterintuitive, but the wrong time to be asking for favors, to be asking for counsel, to be asking for support is at the very moment you need it, as the first time. So while that takes time, it means that you really want to get into a situation where you are developing rapport when there is no ask.
I agree. And I'll share one more tip. The whole way that I developed this pinch myself, and sometimes I even dig my fingernail in to remind myself to be quiet, is working with a very reserved person. And I can get very impatient. And early in my career, I was coaching a young man who was starting up a company, and he was very deliberate in everything he said. And there were times that he would make a statement and pause, and I'm not exaggerating, for 8 to 10 seconds. Y'all, that is an eternity when you're trying to force yourself to listen. And we were working on the phone, and it's even worse on the phone. And so I got to where I started doing this, and I would count quietly to myself so I didn't interrupt him. He just needed time to process it. And do you know, after we met for several times, he said to me, he said, in all the years I've worked with people, no one has ever not interrupted me until working with you. And I told him, I said, that's the greatest compliment I could ever get, because I have to work at it every day of my life. So I think that type of person, sometimes if you don't give them the time to really respond, they can be really challenging to work with.
And there's another question that engages on diversity as well. The previous one was about, different demographics and their reluctancy to open up. But in this question, it seems to be a diversity about in terms of gender and or race, in preparing for an interaction, a meeting, an event, how to draw the line, or where the line is between making assumptions and then treating each person as an individual versus making stereotypical assumptions. Obviously, I think avoiding stereotypes is probably the best possible method, but turning that over to you guys.
Yeah, of course, avoid stereotypes. One of the things I try to do very quickly when I recognize there might be a situation that could be tricky is make sure I'm creating a comfortable environment for the person I'm meeting with, so that they know that I'm not only judging them, but I am, back to this, eternally curious, interested in hearing both their point of view and how they see whatever you're describing as being potentially problematic. And listen, we all walk in with tapes playing in our minds. So the key is to make sure, as a part of building relationships, that you're aligned, that I, as the person wanting to talk with you and build a relationship with you, Lewis, want to hear where you're coming from, what matters to you. And I'm going to share, but only to the extent it makes you more comfortable, not because it makes me feel better. And there's a difference there. Sometimes we talk about ourselves because we enjoy talking about ourselves, and that's fine with your friends. But when it comes to business relationships, I'm going to share only to the extent that it causes you to be comfortable, which means I'm not going to talk about things that either you don't care about or that aren't going to make you comfortable at all.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
All right. And then we had a comment/question about, starting a meeting with an agenda overview. Seems like a very common way that people would start a meeting. and trying to end with a question of, does this meet your expectations, or is there anything else that you would like to address? This person commented that if what comes up is off topic, you can kind of put it to the side and come back to it, or schedule a secondary meeting. But reading into that question a bit, I guess there's something in there about like maybe when to deviate from the agenda. When does the conversation say, you know, actually what we thought was important isn't the most important thing?
Yeah, so I think that many meetings, particularly meetings which have a defined agenda as opposed to a touch base, an agenda makes sense. And in fact, for some companies or some organizations, an agenda is expected. You have to read the situation. The thing you touched on, which I find to be easy to overlook, and yet it is mission critical, is to always conclude a meeting with two things: a slide or an allowance of time for next steps, which includes the next contact.
Yeah.
You know, I said earlier, the idea that relationships are in a constant state of deterioration. The way to fight that off is for continuity, sustainability. And so nothing should ever end without plans for the next contact, whether that's next week or an email, or let's set the next meeting.
You know, I'll add one thing, and that is that even if it's an informal meeting, sometimes it's really helpful to say at the beginning, you know, I have about 3 different things I was thinking we'd cover today, but I also want this to be a flexible meeting. And so I'm a big believer that you should be transparent with even the structure and organization of your meeting. If I'm running a meeting with a big group, there's always an agenda and it's a lot more structured. But when I'm trying to build a relationship, a lot of times I try to be more casual, because I have found that I naturally am so structured and so organized that I can actually put people off if I'm too structured and they thought the goal was to build a relationship. So that's my tip, that I have that agenda, which makes me happy, but I don't necessarily place it in front of the other person. We just talk through it in a more casual way.
And I think, Keri, what you're kind of getting at is this barometer that I use, which is the smaller the group, the less the need for an agenda. The bigger the group, particularly as it becomes 6 or 8 or 10 or 20 people, it's mission critical to avoid scope creep and detours.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then one person here, so we talked about, you know, the touching the finger and, you know, avoiding talking too much, but relatedly, how can you know that you're talking too much? Are there cues from other people? You know, body language, physical cues, anything that you can look to see like, okay, I need to shut up now.
Well, in the absence of more information, it's the 80-20 rule, which is you should be listening 80% of the time and talking 20% of the time. As I mentioned before, we learn with our ears and our eyes, not with our mouths.
It's so true. I would say that one of the big things, and I've coached a lot of young people who have to have these kind of conversations, and a lot of times they will ask questions, and after about 5 minutes, I'll ask them, are you getting the kind of answers that you want? And they can't tell me what they've even heard yet. I think that's a real cue that you're asking too many questions. They're closed questions because you're not getting the details you need from them. And so kind of reflecting on, am I getting what I need out of this? Can give you a cue whether or not you're talking too much.
And Lewis, one thing that I've found, because I've actually done some postmortems on important meetings with important conversations with someone a month later, particularly about a good relationship, is if the person you're chatting with feels good about the discussion, that means you have the right balance. If they either feel worn out or they feel cleaned out, that means there was not a good balance.
And I just say, as we're wrapping up, that I just want to thank you all. I know it's lunch. I know everybody's multitasking, and y'all have given us some fantastic feedback, and I really appreciate that. It's made this a lot of fun. And, you know, hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, so we are nearing the end of the webinar. So I'll go ahead and do our wrap up here, where I will let you know that, as Rodney already mentioned, and Keri did as well, obviously, thank you guys for joining us today. We will be following up with some of the information covered in today's session, including links to articles referenced and books if you want to go explore those on your own. We'll also include some information about Rodney and Keri's full day course that we run here with HDO that as I mentioned, is having its first run this fall in November. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions about the actual running of this webinar themselves, I'm going to drop my email address into the chat. Feel free to send any comments, suggestions for improvement for the future to us. We value that feedback. We want to make sure that these are as valuable as possible, especially as you're taking your lunch break to join us for the most part. But really, thanks again for joining us, for being an active and engaged audience. And I just really hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day.